Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. In 1990, a young woman was strangled on a jogging path near the home of Pat Brown and her family. Brown suspected the young man who was renting a room in her home and quickly uncovered strong evidence that pointed to him, but the police dismissed her as merely a housewife with an overactive imagination. It would be 6 years before her former boarder would be brought in for questioning, but the night Brown took action to solve the murder was the beginning of her life's work. Pat Brown is now one of the nation's few female criminal profilers, a sleuth who assists police departments and victims' families by analyzing both physical and behavioral evidence to make the most scientific determination possible about who committed a crime. Brown has analyzed many dozens of seemingly hopeless cases and brought new investigative avenues to light. In The Profiler, Brown opens her case files to take readers behind the scenes of bizarre sex crimes, domestic murders, and mysterious deaths, going face-to-face with killers, rapists, and brutalized victims. It's a rare, up-close, first-person look at the real world of police and profilers as they investigate crimes, the good and bad, the cover-ups, and the successes. The book this evening that we're going to be discussing is The Profiler, My Life Hunting Serial Killers and Psychopaths, with my special guest, Pat Brown. Welcome to the program, and thank you for agreeing to this interview, Pat Brown.
Hi, Dan. How are you this evening?
Very good, thank you. Thank you very much for agreeing to this program. And for those that were trying to listen a couple of days ago, we're on now. So finally, we had some technical problems.
Difficulties, yes, but we got over them. So,
yes.
And apparently, neither one of us have anything to do on a Friday evening.
That's it. We're doing what we like to do.
That's concerning, but yes.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, in the very first chapter of The Profiler, you start right at the very beginning of this story, as it turns out to be an amazing journey in the end. Now, take us back to a time when you and your family were asked to rent a room to a certain young man.
Right. Well, sometimes really things do happen in life and we just don't see it coming. And we certainly don't think it's going to be life-changing. Because I pretty much had my life set out ahead of me as to how I planned to live it. I had 3 children. I was homeschooling. And that was pretty much my intention, was to homeschool them until they went to college. And just, and I was studying sign language. I was going to become a sign language interpreter, and I was beginning to do some interpreting. So I had this fairly peaceful suburban life. And then we were in the process of adopting our 3rd child, and we were required to fingerprint everybody who came into the house. And it was getting a little bit difficult to get people in, and we needed the money. One income in the Washington, D.C. area doesn't exactly, keep you going. So,
right.
And this is even the days before recession, so I needed to get some extra income in the house. And so I rented rooms, and I was having a little bit of trouble getting people in. So one of my girlfriends said to me, "Hey, will you rent a room to the guy I just hired at my job, because we're dating and he wants to live closer to us, and we were going to the same church." And I was skeptical because he was not a student. And some of the things I warn people about when I talk about how we get ourselves in trouble in relationships and how do we get psychopaths into our lives, I say it's because we're desperate. We're either too lonely, so we grab a guy and bring him in as our boyfriend before we know who he is. In this case, I needed money, quite frankly.
Sure.
And so even though I was skeptical and not all that comfortable with having a slightly older guy who was 26, who was not a student, come live in my home, because he passed the fingerprints, when I took him in, he got fingerprinted and came back clean, and because he didn't have any bad habits that I knew about, drinking, drugging, and all that stuff, I guess.
Right.
So killing women apparently was not on the application for the room, but he seemed okay, and I needed the money, so I was just kind of willing to say, okay, let's give it a shot, and so I did, and he moved in, and that was a big mistake, and I wouldn't, at the time I just didn't think that was that. Who would think it was going to be something like this? I mean, sometimes you get a renter that gets annoying and you want to get rid of them. But certainly you don't think they're going to be somebody that could be a psychopathic or somebody that could be a serial killer. But he started behaving strangely quite frankly, immediately. And over the 4 weeks he lived in my house, there was just so many things he did. You just kept going, what's wrong with this guy? And my girlfriend decided the same thing, and so she broke up with him a month after he moved in, and it was the very day she told him that the relationship was over, that this girl was brutally raped and murdered right between her house and mine on a path that he walked. And he had walked home from her house to my house, and that's where the girl got murdered.
Now, the thing is, you were talking about strange behavior, so I wanted to really establish that. He moves into the house, because at first you say that you were interested in having this guy, and your girlfriend at least vouch for him. Your husband was a little bit uncomfortable, but that was just based because he really didn't want anybody else living in this house, ideally. And you kind of said, well, he's a little bit strange. I mean, he seemed to be very... Tell us a little bit about his behavior, though, because at first it doesn't seem so weird, and then you say quickly it changes, but at first you talk about, well, just a little strange behavior. Tell us a little bit about his behavior and how it accelerates in just a few weeks.
Right, exactly. And I did what many people do. I excused certain peculiarities. One, because, as human beings, we always feel guilty about judging other people.
Sure.
It's like, well, nobody's perfect. Nobody's exactly like we would be like. Then, we have to give them a little bit of a leeway there. And then I looked at myself and I think, okay, I'm kind of weird. So I'm a little bit weird. So should I say this guy's, too weird to live in my house? Just because he's got some just because he's a little goofy, But yes, one of the things I tell people about when you're looking at psychopathic behavior, there's a thing called the Psychopathy Checklist that was done by Dr. Robert Hare, and he has these specific things that set up those red flags, those signals, things like being very manipulative, being a pathological liar, having grandiose thinking. There's like 10 of them in his checklist. And, when you start seeing those kinds of things, then you can say maybe he's not just a little unusual or a little quirky. Maybe you should start saying there's something wrong with this person. And that's exactly what happened with him. And you asked for an example. We talked about grandiose thinking. He would come up with stuff that just made you stop and think, really? Did that really happen to you? Or, I was in special ops is one of the favorite lines of all serial killers. I don't know how many guys say they're a special ops. It's just unbelievable. Right. Because, being a normal Army guy or a normal Air Force guy or having a normal job isn't cool. But being in special ops, there's something every guy wants to say. And, of course, most guys won't say it because they're not in special ops. But a lot of the serial killers often say that, male psychopaths. And I was kind of funny because I was chatting with my son, and we were talking about this particular special ops line that they use. And my son is temporarily working as a bouncer in a bar. But he's going to be joining the military pretty soon, and he's going into military intelligence. But meanwhile, while he was waiting for his college documentation to come in, he took this job as bouncer. And one of the more popular jobs for psychopaths is bouncer, because it's, one of those power control jobs, and, you push people around and say, I'm a bouncer. It's security work. And he came home one night and he goes, guess what, Mom? I said, what? He goes, hey, one of the guys I work with I always thought was a psychopath. He just told me he was in special ops. And I just said, well, there you go. So this was the kind of thing I was hearing from the renter. Bizarre stories about his life in the military that just didn't make sense. Grandiose kind of things. People were always attacking him when he was walking home. People would jump out of the bushes and stab him. I mean, I'm thinking, how come all these things keep happening to you? these crazy things. And every story that he told would always be exaggerated to the point where I just didn't believe it.
Right,
So
right.
that's the pathological lying that we see from these kind of people. And it happens very quickly. I mean, if you meet a person, you're not going to see it necessarily in the first 30 minutes. But if you hang around them for a number of days or weeks, those things start showing up. So if people are considering dating, they're dating somebody, considering getting into a relationship, if they start seeing this stuff, they just want to run away really quickly.
So your friend she received a ring from Walt Williams, and he said that, geez, it cost $1,000, and she was skeptical, and she went and got it appraised, and it was $50. But more so than that was just what she felt was his pathological lying, and so she broke up with him. Now that
right.
same day
But I want to mention something to you. Let's talk about that ring. Do you know the girl that was the ballet dancer who was just murdered in New York? She was going to a college in Pennsylvania, and I'm just blanking on her name. I knew it last week because it was the big story of last week. And she came home for her Thanksgiving holiday, and she went missing out of her house. Right. And she was eventually found. Her body was found in a park nearby, and then her boyfriend was arrested. And apparently she had this on-again, off-again relationship with a boyfriend. Well, my renter and this guy both did the same thing. They both went out and got rings for their ladies, and they both came back and claimed that the rings were real gems that cost them a whole lot of money. And this fellow that killed the girl in New York turned out, when she found out that the ring was worth $29,
mm-hmm.
and she confronted him on it. And my friend, when she was given the ring by this fellow living in my house, he said, I'm paying on this thing for months and months and months. And she kind of looked at him like, really? I've only known you a month. Why would you give me this expensive a ring? And she questioned that it was not a real ring. So she went down to the jeweler, and she asked, to get it appraised. And the jeweler looked at it and said, as far as I'm concerned, this is just a piece of junk jewelry. And maybe $30, maybe $40. Well, when I eventually went through his trash in his room, I found the receipt for that ring. And sure enough, it was a piece of costume jewelry. So it was funny when I read this story about the dancer who was just murdered recently, and that was the same thing this fella did. So a lot of the behaviors of psychopaths are very, very similar. And those are big red flags when they start doing that stuff.
Now take us back to the day of the murder. What actually happened? You said, you note in your book that your community, I guess it's a suburb, so basically it's a smaller community, that there's never been a reported murder before. So tell us about Anne and the murder, and about you hearing the news and how you heard the news. Tell us about that whole event.
Okay, yeah. Well, when I moved into this neighborhood, it looked very safe, and certainly it has been a very safe community. I've lived in this area for 25 years, and that was the first murder in our area. And since then has been the only murder. So we're talking about a pretty long time. Now, if you drive down a mile down the road, things are getting bad down there. But, I mean, our little community just happens to be this little teeny area with its own police department. And we're near university, but we just have kind of a small enclave. And it's pretty nice. And so we kind of live very comfortably in the town, never thinking much about anything like this going on. And I was out of town for that night, and when I came back, my friend called me up, and she said, "Did you hear?" And I'm like, "About what?" And she's like, "Well, just at the softball field." And this is where my boys played sports. My daughter played softball.
Sure.
That was the field they played on, 3 times a week. The men were out playing softball, and one of the guys hit a shot that went into the stream beyond the field, and when they went to retrieve the ball, they found the naked body of this girl in the stream. And that pretty much freaked everybody out because, I mean, can you just imagine finding something like that, and it just, everybody's absolutely horrified. But one of the sad things about this case, and this is reality in our world of crime and how jurisdictions handle cases. The girl was from Texas, and so she came to this area to work. She was an intern in the area. Her family was not here, and she was not from here. And because of that, I don't think enough people cared.
Okay.
She was not one of ours. I mean, they felt bad about it. They felt sad. But oddly enough, they're mostly worried for their own safety. What about us? We feel unsafe. But because she wasn't, somebody from another area, I don't think there was a lot of pressure on the police department from the locals to solve the crime. As soon as they just kind of disappeared really quickly, nobody talked about it. Within a week, nobody talked about the crime anymore. It's kind of shocking to me.
Right. Now, I think it's the next day, if I'm not correct, you speak to Walt, and what is his reaction when you speak of the murder on the pathway?
Yeah, well, I definitely thought this, I knew he walked that path, and I knew my friend had broken up with him, so I asked him, he comes down to the kitchen, he's just getting his little cereal bowl out, and I'm like, so you say, whoa, were you on the path last night where that girl was killed? And he just turned around, and he looked at me, and then he looked away, looked back, crossed his arms, and says, yeah. But I left the path and cut across a stream, which the girl was found in, behind a bowling alley, and came up on the main road and came back that way, which made no sense whatsoever, because he would have, going away from the house rather than toward it. And then he just got up and left the room. And you know how they say go with your gut sometimes on your reaction to things?
Right.
Gavin DeBecker often says, he wrote a great book called The Gift of Fear. And Gavin DeBecker says in there, pay attention. When the hair stands up on your neck, might be a good reason for it. And I just remember thinking, what the heck? What a creepy response.
Right.
He had no empathy toward the girl that was murdered. He didn't freak out over it. I mean, I just thought it was a weird response. I mean, if I knew I had been walking at the location that a murder victim was found, first of all, I'd just be creeped out by the thought, oh my God, first of all, I could have been the one killed, or I could have run into this, or just how gruesome, or in his particular case, you would have thought he would have had some fear because, he could become a suspect. Even if I wasn't suspicious, just the fact that he was on the path at the time this girl was killed should have made him get a little worried that maybe the police would come knocking on his door. But he showed no emotion whatsoever, and that is, again, one of the signs of psychopathy. It's shallow emotion. Things just don't register, and they just don't respond properly, and because they don't really care. And he didn't.
Now, who did you tell about this? Did you talk to your husband Tony, or did you talk to your friend who had called you, or who did you speak to about this, and what did you decide? What did you conclude?
Well, it was one of those freaky things where when you start getting suspicious of something, you really you want to kind of flesh it out with somebody else. I did talk to my husband at the time, Tony, and he was just one of these people that never liked confrontation.
Right.
He didn't like things that were disturbing. He didn't like things that would change anything. He liked things very stable, and so his response was, "You're just being ridiculous." Even though he didn't like the guy, you're just being ridiculous, and he kind of just walked away from it. And, easier left alone and ignored than to deal with it. So that didn't quite give me much feedback. So there really wasn't a lot of people to talk to about it because I really wasn't sure what I was telling people at that point in time. What I actually did was the next day when he went to work, I went to the library with the children, and I took out the books and started looking up psychopathy. I looked at Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist. That's the first time I heard about the Psychopathy Checklist.
Oh, really?
To see I had never looked into anything. This was not my field before. I was not into criminal justice. I was not into serial killers. I was not a true crime show watcher. I just wasn't into that stuff. I was more interested in anthropology and cultures and different, and my children, raising my kids and teaching them. So I really wasn't into that. So I went to the section in the library and I saw that book and I pulled it out. And when I started going through the Psychopathy Checklist, I started going, oh boy, this certainly is matching this guy. And because I wasn't comfortable with making a conclusion based on just some whim of mine. I thought I might be completely out to lunch on this one. And I really didn't want to rush into the police department, make a fool of myself, first of all, and also accuse a completely innocent person. Blow something up out of proportion and accuse them of something with absolutely nothing to go on. So I really wanted to make sure I wasn't being ridiculous. And so I went to the library and I got this information, and it only supported what the feelings I had about what was going on, and that's what encouraged me when I got back home to then put on a pair of gloves and go to his room and see whether there was evidence in his room, because I thought that I better find something more to go to the police with rather than just my innuendos. Was there anything in his room that would actually link to the crime?
And what did you find in the bedroom?
Well, it's funny. Looking back on it now, I think, why didn't I try? I must have looked at his car, because he had a dead car outside with a car with dead tags on it. He wasn't driving it because of dead tags. And now maybe I looked in the windows and think, I'm sure I didn't get into the trunk because I didn't have the keys, but now I wonder whether he had them or I didn't look hard enough for those car keys, because I keep wondering what was in the trunk now of that car. I don't know that I was that clever a detective at that point in time, but I did go through his room looking in his drawers to see if there were those souvenirs I'd heard about, and I did not find that. And when I went to most of the room and I didn't come across anything, I thought, well, probably isn't anything here. But then I noticed his trash, and because he had these big, hefty trash bags sitting there with some pizza boxes on top, and I thought, well, maybe I better look in the trash. And that's where I found what I considered possible evidence linked to the crime scene, which was all of the clothing he had worn that night he had thrown away, which I thought was kind of unusual. I mean, I don't know if you've ever done this, but I don't usually come home, even from a hike in the woods, where perhaps I did get drenched in a rainstorm or end up in a muddy river. I don't usually come home and throw all my clothing away. It's kind of expensive, to throw away your tennis shoes, your brand new tennis shoes, and your brand new jeans, and everything else. He did have a shirt that was shredded in the back, and I believe that was from the briar bushes, and that one made sense to be thrown away because it was too damaged to wear. But the other items weren't damaged, and really
they were just wet. Were they full of blood?
They were wet. They almost like he either came back, because they weren't muddy. It's almost like he came back and used the hose outside to hose himself down.
Right.
And then just walked in the house and took them out and threw them away. Perhaps because he didn't want to enter the door looking muddy.
Sure.
Or maybe I don't know why. You have to understand sometimes these guys don't necessarily think really clearly either. The other possibility is that I don't know what the real good reason would be, but they weren't muddy, but they were wet. And I asked him about that later on. It was not at the time, but in a later interview I did with him years later, I asked him why his clothes were wet and why he threw them away. And he never answered the wet part too well. But he did tell me that when the clothes got wet, when the jeans got wet, he didn't like the way they dried. So that's why he threw them away. And I remember thinking, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, because don't you ever wash your jeans?
Yeah,
they get washed once a week.
They get washed once a week. They get washed once a week. What a trauma.
Yeah, I mean, so his answers didn't quite make sense, but that was really, to me, not normal to throw your clothing away. There was also a knife in the trash. There was also some mud wrapped in plastic, like saran wrap, and I never did quite figure out what the purpose of that was. There was, and so those were the kind of things. Those were what I took into the police department, along with a story that he had written, which was called "My Silent Enemy." And this particular interesting story talked about how the hero of the story, or the protagonist of the story, would hunt filth and vermin in the park. And he was the face. He was death used my name and death wore my face. And he realized in the story, the protagonist, that I was my own silent enemy, that he indeed was actually the killer. I think that's kind of an interesting story, that someone should be writing. Now, of course, it could just be he's an interesting fiction writer, but he wrote that and handed that story to me about a week before the homicide. So I took that into the police with all the information about his behaviors, with the clothing from the trash, and they just made fun of me when I sat there and just said, "Oh, we don't see what your problem is with this guy." And I'm like, and it really blew me away. It still does to this day. I mean,
what was it? Something about they thought you were a white woman suspicious of a black man. Meanwhile, you're married to a West Indian man.
Right.
So you kind of explain, hey, listen, I don't got a problem with that. I have, listen, that's not an issue.
Right. I mean, the whole thing made. I think they kept looking for things to put me down. One was that I was a board housewife. And I had to say, no, that is not. Then they kind of had that, you're one of these overly suspicious people. I'm like, not really. I'm the one who rented the room to him. My husband was overly suspicious, not me, you know. And then the racial issue, they did bring that up, and then I had to tell them, you know, my husband is also black. I don't think that is a big deal. And I tried to explain to them. I tried to reason with them. I said, look, my husband also has been on that path. You know, he's a soccer player. He has jogged on that path. I said, I don't suspect my husband. I mean, he doesn't exhibit these kind of behaviors, and he was not on the path that night. But this man was on the path that night. He admitted to being on the path that night. He had just been dumped by his girlfriend. He calls women sluts, bitches, and whores. Yeah. He writes a story about killing people in the park.
And uses some of that same language.
Yes, and he threw all his clothing away. What part of this don't you get? What part of this doesn't make you think you should at least interview him? And this was 2 days after the crime. So this was before. There was a young man who ended up killing himself another couple of days later, and they decided to claim he committed the crime, and they shut it down administratively for years because of that. But this was even before that, and they showed no interest. And I've never been able to figure that part out. It was true that the department had never worked a homicide case in their life, so this was new to them. But even if you didn't have experience, and even if you didn't understand psychopaths, and even if you didn't understand serial killers, you just kind of would think they would want to interview a guy who admitted to being at the crime scene.
Yeah.
That just still boggles my mind. I mean, how pitiful can you get? And of course, this is, you know, not necessarily typical of all police departments. It was this particular police department and this particular detective who had that issue, and it was a very inexperienced police department as far as homicide went, because they were a park police department as opposed to being like our county police department. But
right.
Still, it was kind of mind-boggling, you know.
Well, the thing is, you were there at 2 days, and they didn't take a look at your information, and then based on this kid commits suicide and not much, I mean, no real evidence of any connection to it, they almost closed the case and put it on him, as we will explain a little bit later. See,
right. That's
part of this is your discovery of information. Even though you think you're getting first-hand information from authorities, you're getting some misinformation, which again must have been quite frustrating when you find out you've been deceived. Now,
right.
Now with this, now you go to the police. He doesn't take you seriously. He doesn't really take any notes, and he dismisses you. So what do you do next?
Well, I kind of just went away, thinking for a while there that I was really stunned. I think I was almost in shock because they didn't do anything. And then I kept expecting that this would all turn around, that,
right.
You know, I must be misinterpreting his attitude, and that a day or two later I'd hear that this man, well, I kicked Walt Williams out of the house the next day. I had my husband, he was late
right.
on his rent, but just had my husband tell him to leave, and he just did. He just picked up his stuff, he took his car over the dead tags, and just drove away, and that was the last time I saw him for many years. So he was out of the house, but I kind of expected I'd just pick up the newspaper and I'd read, you know, police have arrested Walt Williams, or at least I'd hear through the grapevine that they'd interviewed the guy. And I didn't hear anything. And I started calling them going, did you interview him? And they just told me, no, we did not interview him. He is not a person of interest at this time. And I could not believe it. And then I heard the rumor that this other young man had killed himself a few days after the crime, I think it was about 5 days after the crime, and had shot himself and committed suicide with a shotgun, and that he was the guy that killed the girl. That was the rumor that went around town. And I thought to myself, well, maybe they just have evidence linking this guy to the crime, and, you know, Walt Williams was just one of those freaky dudes who came along the path either, you know, 20 minutes before or 20 minutes after the crime went down, and he's a weird dude who threw his clothes away. I try to make all kinds of reasons why that would make sense, you know, and it's possible he could have just been a psychopathic fellow who was there around the time. And, you know, so I figured, well, they must know something I don't, because sometimes it's true, you know, if you look at a lot of investigations, you can assume something is true on the outside, but if you're on the inside of the investigation, you know otherwise, because you know what the evidence actually shows. You know what has been done. And so I thought, well, maybe they have evidence linking this other young man to the crime, And that's the way it is. And so I kind of let it go for a while, but it did keep bugging me because it just seemed that so much evidence pointed to Walt Williams. And it took a long time for me to then decide to go and start investigating whether this other young man really could have committed the crime or not. And I found out that there was no evidence linking him to the crime. Absolutely.
You got to speak to the parents, and that's where you got some information, didn't you?
Yeah, I went to speak to the parents, and they were completely devastated because not only had the son committed suicide, but then the police showed up to tell them that their son was a murderer. Can you imagine that? I mean, you know, it was just the cruelest thing in the world. I could not believe it. And they gave me the autopsy for their son, and some of the things I had heard, some of the suspicions, the reason he had been linked to this crime was, for example, that he had scratch marks from the briar bushes in the genital area and from raping her. And there was nothing in the autopsy report. He had no scratches on his body whatsoever. And so, then I talked to the parents about what his issues were. He was an 18-year-old boy who was just depressed over. He had also his girlfriend. He broke up, and so he's another depressed guy. But this young man was 18 years old. Talked to a number of people. He just didn't seem to have that kind of personality. And this would have likely been his first crime, and the type of crime that was committed against this girl was much more advanced. You know how they say there's a serial killer starts out with a simpler crime and then he advances, sometimes in his sadism. And this, to me, was just too much for this young man. It seemed to me that this person who had committed that crime had committed a crime before. And at that time, Walt Williams was much older. So, the chances of him committing that crime, he was, I think, 26 years old, was much more likely than a kid who just barely turned 18. And eventually I talked to the family of the victim, and they told me that there was hair of the same color at the scene matching this young man, although they didn't say there was any DNA or any mitochondrial DNA from the hair root matching this young man. And then they told me there was also some DNA. Oh, yeah, they told me not just the hair was one issue, but then there was supposedly some DNA. And all of that turned out to be a lie. That the police had told them that, but it did not exist. And so there was absolutely nothing connecting this young man to that particular crime.
But at the same time, when did you find out that you were told by police that the DNA excluded Walt Williams? When were you told that?
That came later because, and that was 6 years later. 6 years after the fact, a new detective came into the department, so I kept pressuring them, and the new detective reopened the case and took a look at Walt Williams and said, and he called me up and he said, "Wow, I can't believe they let this guy walk." And he was astounded that they hadn't brought him in right away. So he was the one that actually brought Walt Williams in. He called him up. I mean, they went out to pick him up in Virginia. They brought him into the police station. He was polygraphed. He failed. They took him down, got his blood. They interviewed him, interrogated him, and said he told a bunch of bogus stuff. Told a false alibi, all kinds of information that they just rolled their eyes at. And they said, we believe it's him. They asked me at that time if I would testify in court, and I said yes. So I pretty much knew they were pretty solid about this guy. And they were simply waiting for the DNA to come back. So that was when I had a lot of hope that all the efforts I put in, finally we're going to get this guy off the street. Because they were looking for his DNA. They figured they had the DNA because they were, checking it against his DNA.
Sure.
And so 5 months went by. That's how long it took. People think DNA comes back in a week. Well, it doesn't. It takes months sometimes. For 5 months, I was on pins and needles, wondering what was going to be happening, waiting for the phone call. And finally, I called them and said, "What's going on?" And they said, Walt Williams has been excluded by the DNA. And I was so stunned. I said, "You got to be kidding me." At that point, I was pretty darn sure I was right. I said, "You're kidding me." I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "No, tell me the truth. If it was not inconclusive, in other words, there wasn't enough DNA to match.
Right.
I can handle that. Believe me. If you tell me that, I will understand why you don't go to court. But please don't lie to me and tell me he was excluded if the DNA absolutely did not exclude him." And they just told me, "Ms. Brown, get a life."
Get a life.
They hung up on me. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Huh?
Really? Well.
Yeah, which of course indicated that the information they gave me was true. And something in me told me that they were lying. And it took me a year. I called quite a few times, and then one day I just lucked onto this guy at the police department who, for whatever reason, opened up the report and read it to me, which I'm still kind of surprised he did that. And he read to me that there was no DNA. And then I had it verified by the state's attorney's office. And so there never was any DNA to match to Walt Williams. So they could not have excluded him.
So is that, at that time, do you decide, and what are the circumstances in which you do eventually interview people around and surrounding Walt Williams, and then eventually you're even compelled to interview Walt Williams? So how does that all come about?
Well, one of the things that happened along the way was that I was really bothered by, first of all, the concept that they were calling me nuts. In spite, for the first 6 years, they were saying that I was completely wrong. And then I was told that the DNA did not match him, which was not true. So I just kept thinking, I got to find out more information. I need to know more. And so I decided I would go and interview people, anybody I could. So I interviewed his father, interviewed his sister. I interviewed his new wife's mother. I wasn't able to get to the new wife. I did talk to her later on. And I talked to his ex-employers. And I was pretty well convinced through all of that he did fit the label of a psychopath, because even his family didn't have a problem giving me a long interview. I sat down with them for quite a long time and chatted with them, and they all said, "We don't know what's wrong with him. We're scared of him."
Really?
And this was across the board, from employers, ex-girlfriends, family. They all had the same stories. So there is no question in my mind that the man does fulfill very nicely the label of psychopath. There is no question in my mind that he has got a lot of disturbed behavior, but it doesn't mean he killed anybody. Right. And that was the other thing I was doing was looking into other crimes that he might have committed, because I was hoping I could link him to something else. In other words, if you can't get a serial killer on one crime, perhaps you can find another crime that they committed. It doesn't really matter which one you get them for, if you could just get them off the streets. So I thought I'd see if I could find something else that might link to him. And so
how'd you go about that?
Well, I looked at all the crimes in the area. I tried to determine crimes that would be most likely if he had committed the crime of Ann Kelly, if he committed her murder, if he had done that murder. I looked for other ones that I did not consider too far outside of the behavioral pattern, the style of the crime. And then I pursued to see whether there was any possibility that he had any links to those crimes. And it was really very interesting, because I actually purposely picked out a number of crimes that I thought he couldn't have any, that didn't look like him at all. And I couldn't come up with any links to those, so at least I didn't feel like I was, creating stuff that wasn't there. But I did find a number of crimes that he did have a good possibility of being linked to. And I pursued it with those police departments, and I found it was very difficult to get them to consider somebody that they hadn't considered.
Oh, sure.
This is always a problem for people who believe somebody is committing crimes, and I sort of understand it from both sides of the equation. I mean, I've been the person knocking on the police door, going, "Did you check? Could you consider this guy?" And I've been on the other side where people come knocking on my door, going, "I know a guy who's a serial killer, and I think he's killed these 10 people." And I don't really want to hear it either sometimes, because you get a lot of crackpots, and you get a lot of people with very vivid imaginations who really don't have any evidence. They just have a weird guy that they think is committing all these crimes. So I understand it from the police point of view as well. But it was very frustrating, because I did believe he had some good connections to some other crimes in the area, two in particular, which he had excessive amounts of links to, enough to make him a good suspect in both those crimes. And it's very, very difficult to get anybody to look into it. So
and
he's
so
still out there.
so they did not look at these other crimes that you thought fit his signature and his MO, and could be attributed to the info.
Well, some have and some haven't. I had one that really did look into one quite well, and then as he was looking into it, as a matter of fact, I had an FBI agent. It was in our area, Brad Garrett, was looking into one with me and agreed that there were some pretty darn interesting connections to Walt Williams with that particular crime. But the local police then started looking into it, and then I think somebody went off to Iraq or something, and that kind of just killed everything. And after that, you just never could get them back focused on it again. And from outside the police department, people don't have much power, to do anything. I mean, I contacted the family, and the family contacted the police department and said, please pay attention to what she's saying. But if you don't get the right detective who really wants to pursue it, it just may not happen. And there is one of the things that's always frustrated me is there is no accountability process for police departments. And I think it would benefit the police department as well as the families to have that accountability process, because then, it would just be there as part of the law that after a certain period of time, the family would have rights to see the police files or to designate somebody to look at the police files or to designate a special committee. I believe they have this in England, that you can actually call for a committee.
Really?
To review, okay. Yes, because we have nothing like that. There are some cases where 20 years later, the family still has no idea what's going on with that case. And I have a case right now which just drives me bonkers because I had to sign a confidentiality agreement with this particular police department, and I don't sign that very often, but this police department insisted on it. And I put in a week's work with this police department, and I flew in. That was pro bono, paid out of my own pocket to do the work. Came up with some very interesting avenues of investigation. I came up with a different suspect. And when I left town, because it was not their suspect, and this case has been open for quite a while, they just basically told the family that I was wrong. And they told the family that they had investigated this particular person and they'd already done certain interviews, and I know it's not true because I've seen the files. And the family keeps calling me, and they keep saying, Pat, this might put a smile on your face. They're going to check out this person now. I'm thinking, that's not what I said. They keep thinking that finally the police are going to be looking at doing something with my profile, and I know it's not happening, and I cannot tell the family. In spite of the fact it's been years and years since this homicide went down, I can't tell the family anything. And I feel it's really so wrong, because in my opinion, why can't they see the profile? If they don't think it's any good, if they're not going to pursue it, why don't they just show the family how dumb it is? let another detective of their choice, somebody that they trust, go take a look at it. Let's have a committee take a look at it, so that we know whether all avenues have been pursued. But there's no right.
I guess what they think is that some of the profiles think they're a sort of an elite team that sort of leaves everybody else in the dust, or everybody else is being trained. But now let's get to that profiling, though, because as a result of Walt Williams, as a result of your experience with police, with your frustration, with you gathering evidence and then having been vindicated, where you have your information verified, but you were right, you weren't crazy, you were right. Now, what do you do as a result? And tell our audience exactly, despite what they might have seen on Criminal Minds, what does profiling mean?
Well, what I decided to do after I saw this go down was that I really felt there was a lack of understanding of psychopaths, a lack of understanding of how serial killers operate, and a lack of understanding of how to reconstruct a crime and to recognize certain evidence. And that I started studying this and researching, how this could be improved and how profiling could be applied. And what I did find was a lot of Criminal Minds stuff. And I know a lot of people love Criminal Minds, and I've watched quite a few segments of it now because, I actually, after a while, you do kind of hooked on the characters in there. But most time I laugh when I'm watching the series because it's so off. And the method of criminal profiling that is often shown on television and has actually been promoted through many years through the FBI, is called inductive profiling. And what that simply means is that in order to understand more about serial killers and psychopaths and predators, a lot of research was done, interviews were done at prisons, and information was gathered about their behaviors, which is all good and fine. I have no objection to this whatsoever. I've read those books, and I'm very appreciative of all the studies and research that has been done. But then they came up with this methodology to help identify serial killers and link crimes together that was really based more on, I would say, statistics and percentages.
Right.
You know, as far as some basic information goes, like, for example, that most serial killers are male. Well, that's true. I mean, most serial killers are male, especially ones who rape and murder, because usually people who rape are male, although we do have a couple incidents out there where a woman has committed a rape, usually with an object, obviously, but still it's a rape. And that's fairly rare. And we do have women who are serial killers. They kill their own children often. They kill patients in hospitals one after the other. Some of them are black widows who kill their husbands one after the other, and some help their boyfriends. And then we have the weird ones like Aileen Wuornos, who actually just shot down the men that she was picking up as prostitutes. So women are serial killers too. But yes, it's true when you can find rape dead women in the bushes, usually you got a male serial killer. So they used a lot of statistics to make determinations. And then on top of that, what was really concerning when I was studying and trying to figure out, you know, you look at a crime scene and you analyze, you look at all the evidence out there, and you come up with conclusions. Well, what I was finding was that when I was reading some of the profiles put together by inductive profilers, is I didn't understand where they got their conclusion from. They just seemed to come up with something that I could not figure out how they got it. And it was kind of like this, I just felt stupid, actually. I would look at this and go, I don't know how they did it. And, of course, you know, that's why a lot of people think, well, you can't be a profiler unless you go to the FBI, because if you don't go to the FBI, you won't get this incredible hidden wisdom, you know, that's taught behind those secret walls. And then if you did that, you would come out and you would know by looking at crimes, and you would be able to come up with these things like magic. And I'm thinking, really? I can't understand it. Well, it turned out that the reason I didn't understand it is because it wasn't scientific. It wasn't based on the evidence. It was based on guesswork. It was based on percentages, statistics, the thoughts of the theories of the day. And a lot of times, a portion of that profile was completely wrong because it was just made up. And that would send the police on the wrong trail. I don't know if you remember the Baton Rouge serial killer. He was killing a bunch of women down in Louisiana.
Okay.
Derek, what's his name? Derek's one of his names. But anyway, I remember the FBI came out with a profile on that, and they called him a white guy. Turned out he was black. Why did they say he was white? And all I can guess was they decided that there were a number of white women killed, and the prevailing theory was white men kill white women for whatever reason. Right. Mm-hmm. And so they said it was a white guy. And I'm like, wait a minute. You had no business saying that, because there was, you know, if you're going to base something on race, you got to come up with a good reason.
Yeah.
Why you're coming up with why the person's black, the person's Hispanic. An example might be, if a person commits a certain type of crime. I remember they called me once about a crime that happened down in Florida, and this is one of the networks. They said, well, these people were abducted, and they were driven around, they were kept in somebody's house, and then they were driven around from ATM machine to ATM machine. I said, oh gosh, those guys the guys are probably Mexican who kidnapped them. And they went, why do you say they're Mexican? I said, because that's a common crime in Mexico. Now I can't say for sure they're Mexican, but it is a common crime in Mexico, so I would tell the police, this would be what would be scientific about how I'd state this. I'd state, this is a very similar crime to crimes that are committed in Mexico that we have not seen much in the U.S. I would take a look at a possibility this is a Mexican suspect.
Sure.
If you have any leads in that direction. Well, the network person went away and they came back and he said, guess what, that's right, they're Mexican. But I would explain it where I came up with that conclusion and what the chances were that that conclusion was correct. But to simply just say, for no reason whatsoever, that the person's Mexican, based on absolutely nothing, it makes no sense to me. So there was no reason that in that particular crime they could have known whether the Baton Rouge serial killer was white or black, because it is not true that white men pick white victims and black men pick black victims. That the only reason that was truer in the past was because serial killers are lazy and they like to be where they're comfortable, and they pick people within a mile of where they live. And in the segregated past, black guys live near black women and white guys live near white women. But, now that times have changed, kind of hard to pin the race, that easily. So there were, to make up stuff that's not based on some scientific evidence or some strong behavioral evidence, that would tell you, oh, this guy's probably, or almost very good chance he's this because. For example, let's say a guy steals a car, right?
Right.
And let's say where I live, Prince George's County, Maryland. Guy steals a car, and he changes the radio station because it was a professor who owned the car, and the professor was professor of Russian something or other at the university. He likes to listen to Tchaikovsky, But the guy who stole the car changes it to rap music. What race is he?
Well, it depends on your time frame. It could be a black guy, but it could be a white guy too. Depends on the age.
You're in PG County, Maryland. Black guys listen to rap here. White guys listen to rap here.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't be able to say. So you have to be.
Yeah.
When you're going to make a determination, you have to think very carefully why you're going to make that determination, and then what you're going to base that determination on. So if it's something specific enough where it's just too unusual, for this to be, if you're going to say the person's black and the person's, let's say a person turned into put in a CD of their own, and the CD was a reggae guy called Yellow Man.
Right.
Well, a pretty good chance the guy's West Indian in Jamaica, because Yellow Man is not known to too many people that are not West Indian. But if he puts in Bob Marley, well, goodness gracious, everybody knows Bob Marley, whites and blacks alike, so you couldn't say the guy was West Indian. So you see, you have to be very specific, either with the physical evidence or the behavioral evidence, and that's what I realized was missing, that a lot of the profiling out there was guesswork. And was just made up stuff. So deductive profiling, which is what I do, says when you examine the crime, you have to examine every detail, the physical details, the behavioral details, the blood spatter, the ballistics, the movements in the room, the culture, the architecture, everything you can, and rebuild the crime so that you know exactly what happened, and then you can determine the motive and who might have done it. If you really want to get very, very detailed, that's deductive profiling, kind of like Sherlock Holmes.
Now, and I know you're a big fan of Sherlock Holmes, so I read that in there somewhere.
That was in there.
Let's talk about, we've only got a few minutes, but I'm going to go a little bit long if you're going to stay with us just for a few more extra minutes, because I want to go through a particular case that I think really demonstrates what you do and how you've made a difference, and especially explaining what you've just explained in a real good demonstration here with this Army Private Sarah Andrews in your chapter, Murder Behind the Bar. Now, it's a fascinating case to what it demonstrates. Now, tell us the details of the murder and the discovery, and what did the police investigation lead them to conclude, and why, and tell us how you became involved in this case. It's a fascinating story.
Yeah, this was one of the earlier crimes that I actually profiled. I had a strange fellow come to me. He was working for the family. He was a bounty hunter, and he ended up working for the family. And I ran into him at a bail enforcement seminar. I was just taking, actually, just to find out what kind of weird people do bail enforcement, because a lot of psychopaths in it. And I ran into this guy, and he found out I was a profile, and I was pretty new at it. But I think he wanted me to kind of back his theories, because he was milking these families for a lot of money, so he could investigate all this stuff and charge them by the hour. And so he told me he gave me the information about this particular crime, and the family did have the crime scene photos, which was kind of unusual since it was still an open case, but it was a very old open case. And this young woman, she was in the military, and she went out one evening with a couple of friends to a couple of bars in the area out at the Midwest, and she went missing. And in the morning, she was found behind one of the bars she went to that night. She was found behind the bar, dumped in the parking lot. She was totally naked except for she had one shoe on, and her leggings were hanging off of that one shoe. Okay. And she was almost kind of she was laid out there in the parking lot. Almost looked like she possibly was posed, but I did later on determine that was not true. It's just the way she landed was very artistic. Just just the way she flopped happened to be kind of an attractive pose. And she also had her driver's license left there with her, which was kind of unique. And this case had been cold for years and years and years. And what happened with this case was the original detectives on the case went down a road of an avenue of investigation, which was not wrong to look at, but they really believed they never stopped to analyze the crime, and which is very common. And because she had some people around her who were involved in drugs, and there was no real evidence she was involved in drugs particularly, other than that she might have smoked a little herb, that somehow they developed this theory that she disappeared out of the bar with some drug people, and they took her to some place, and maybe a house or a garage or something, and they tortured her because she did have some injuries to her body. There was no DNA, so she was not vaginally raped, but they believed it was object insertion for anal rape, and she had bite marks on her hand and breast, and one of her nipples was cut off, and she was battered and bruised. So they had this theory she was taken back to this place, and they tortured her, and then they brought her back and dumped her in the parking lot and threw her license on top of her, some kind of warning. But there was absolutely no evidence that any of this was true. And what really never happened was they never took a look at what happened to this girl and started rebuilding the crime, rebuilding the actual how the crime occurred. And if you actually built how the crime occurred, then you would realize that she was never taken any place, to any location where she was tortured. By building the crime, I was able to prove that she was actually assaulted in the front seat of a van and then dragged into the back, where then she was brutalized and murdered. She was strangled, actually, with coat hangers in the back of this van. And then she was left to lay in the back of the van for a number of hours. And then she was finally, the door of that van was open, and they swung her body out, or he did. He swung her body out and dumped her in the lot where she was left. And I could prove all of this through the injuries on her body because of where the injuries were, what order they occurred in. You could tell what happened and where, and it was in a very constricted space. And what does that look like? Looks like a sexual homicide to me. That looks like a serial killer. Because if she got in the passenger seat of a van and a guy started biting her and then pulled her into the back and anally assaulted her and then strangled her, it doesn't look like a drug deal gone bad to me or some kind of drug retaliation. It looks like a serial killer crime with just one person involved. And the sad thing is, if they had done the crime reconstruction way back when, I think they might have gone down the right trail. And maybe they would have found this guy, but they were too busy looking for drug dealers because they just never did the crime reconstruction. That's what's so important about deductive profiling, is it's really to make sure you don't overlook any little pieces of evidence and don't go with gut. People sometimes say Pat Brown, she used her gut feelings. I'm like, no. That gut feelings are not a part of it. I'm not saying we don't have them.
Right.
But by the time you're finished deducing what happened in the crime, you should take your gut feelings and throw them out the window. I mean,
sure.
you shouldn't have any of your conclusions based on gut feelings. It should be
all the pieces of the puzzle have to fit perfectly. You can't have some leaps of logic, right? It's not a movie.
Right. Now I will admit occasionally there'll be like, just sometimes there's a piece of something you cannot explain.
Sure.
And no, you don't want to throw out your whole crime. If you've got 20 pieces of evidence that all support something, you don't want to say because 21 first piece, I couldn't quite figure it out. Doesn't mean that the other 20 pieces are no good.
No.
If it's something that completely obliterates the other 20, that's one thing. But sometimes what will happen is, people like to believe that crime scenes are, well, whatever happens in the crime scene then makes, it stays exactly, like freezes. But in reality what happens is sometimes the killer himself can mess something up and then make it look, doesn't make any sense. He could also do something to add some piece to the scene that doesn't make any sense. The family can find the body and do something. Maybe it's because they're embarrassed. They don't like the way the body was laying. It's, they don't want anybody to find their daughter looking like that, so they move her body. Some people remove weapons from the scene, especially if it's a suicide. They'll remove the weapon. Sometimes people will steal stuff from a scene. They'll just come and, the relative will find the person. They'll go, well, dang, look, his wallet's over here. Uncle Bob's dead, but, man, he's got money in his wallet. And by the way, I always did want, that nice gold cufflink set of his. And so they'll rob him after he's dead.
Sure.
So then, when the police come in to do the investigation, they think, well, it's a robbery. But it really wasn't a robbery. It might have been a murder for some other reason, and then the nephew came in and stole the crap in the room before he called the police. So there's a lot. Sometimes things can disturb a crime scene and really mess up, trying to understand what happened. So it's never as perfect as we'd like to be. Sometimes it's the weather, or sometimes firefighters come in and the hose the place down, and the weapon flies from one room to another. All kinds of stuff can go just mess the whole thing up. So you have to always be aware of that when you're doing a crime reconstruction, that you might not be seeing it quite the way it was.
Now, explain briefly, we just have a few minutes, but explain briefly, you've done all this work, you're doing these profiles, you've just alluded to that you're doing a lot of this work for free. So how do you earn your money? Why would you do this for free, and what's the upshot for you, other than you can write a fascinating book about it? But tell us what you've established and why you've established it, and how does it work?
Well, I don't think I've ever thought these things through terribly well. I mean, when I went into this, I think the old thing, if I knew what I know now, I would never have done it, type of thing. I probably would think, oh my God, I can't go down that route. That's just ridiculous. I didn't know what I know now, so I kept fighting along, and kept moving in a direction. And the reason I did pro bono work in the beginning was because there's a good way to get my foot in the door. If you're not asking for money, more people are likely to have you come in because they don't have to pay. And I wanted the experience. I wanted to start working with these cases. Later on, I realized that the police didn't have any money anyway. So they were never going to bring a profiler in if they had to pay for the profiler. Now, that's something I'd like to see change, because I'd like to see larger departments have an on-staff profiler, or have the states have a profiler available to everybody. I'd like to see detectives be their own profilers if they have the time to do it, or a detective, that in the department that has specialized in profiling, so he can be brought in on specifically unusual cases, like, that aren't so clear-cut. So I'd like to see all that change, but that's going to probably be another 2 decades before I hope, I or somebody else can impact that. So I did pro bono because it gave me experience, and it also gave the police experience working with a profiler, and it also, just trying to promote profiling. So I still, at this point, do pro bono work, but let me tell you, it is a huge burden, and it certainly doesn't pay your bills. And at the time, I never even thought about writing a book on my cases. I mean, that wasn't really something that crossed my mind at that time in the beginning, that I'm going to, do these cases and write a book. As a matter of fact, because of the problem with prosecution, and what I've discovered is that, we're working these cases, I've been able to solve the cases, but because of the time delay, they haven't been prosecuted, and that's very upsetting to me, and that's why I want to get profilers into the police departments early on, within the first 24 to 48 hours, or at least the first week or two, at least the first month, so that, that the profiler can help with the case and get it going in the right direction, and make sure the evidence doesn't get lost, or that, you're not on the wrong trail for 5 years, so you can't possibly tell the family 5 years later, oh, we were wrong for 5 years. The profile came in and solved the case. That's just embarrassing, so nobody's going to admit to it. So I want the profilers in early so nobody has to deal with this kind of thing. It becomes they just become part of the team early on as a tool. And but the prosecution problem has been just like the Walt Williams case. It isn't happening even if the case is solved or we believe it's solved. You can't prosecute something if it's too late. So this is also an issue. And because of this is what was happening with these cases. They weren't getting prosecuted. It's some people have attacked me because of this in the book. They say, well, look at that. Why aren't you showing more prosecuted cases? And I'm like, well, I don't control that. And I also just was willing to let people know the truth, because one of the things I've always tried to be very strong about is just telling the truth, because I believe if we don't know the truth, we can't fix things. And I think too much is always hidden under the table because of politics and pride and ego. Everybody always wants to be perfect, and everybody wants to be the hero, and nobody wants to take criticism, so we just hide everything. So I decided, now I'll just tell the truth. Let the chips fall where they may, because hopefully this book will break some ground. And it is my hope that the book actually will pick up speed over the years. That it'll become an educational tool over the years. If more and more people will start saying, you got to pay attention to this book. This book is telling the truth. It's showing, first of all, it's the first book on the market that's ever showed how profiling is done. Because there's no other book out there that goes through the cases and breaks it down and shows how a person can profile.
That's right.
And most if you've ever read any of the FBI books or a lot of stuff out there, they don't tell you how they do it. And they want to keep it mysterious so they can retain this feeling of being the only one who can do this and the most brilliant person in the world, the great profiler. As a matter of fact, The Murder Room was another book that just came out about the Vidocq Society, and Richard Walter actually said in that book there's only like 3 real profiles or 5 real profiles in the United States, and the rest of them are frauds. I'm like, which I think I'm one of the frauds he's referring to. I'm like, no, really, Richard? I mean, do you really want to tell people that there's only 5 people who can legitimately do this work in the entire United States?
Well, it's not much of a science. It's not much of a science if you can't train people.
There you go. You just said it. That, Dan, is the exact point. You have just hit the nail on the head. It's not much of a science if you can't train anybody. As a matter of fact, I've never said that, and I think I'm going to attribute that one to you. Absolutely correct. So it's bogus if you can't train people. So what I've done with this book is show you it is a science. You can be trained. Now, it helps if you're logical, because if you're not a logical person, you're just not going to be very good at doing this, so you're just going to suck at it, and I'm sorry that this is not your profession. But if you're a logical person, then you can learn the skills, and you can become a good profiler. And it is my hope, that one day there will be so many profilers around, my name will kind of vanish amidst all the other profilers, because there'll just be so many of them. Just like I said, who's a doctor in the United States? What are you going to say? There's so many doctors in the United States.
Sure.
But actually, if you say, who's a profiler in the United States, you can actually give the names. Robert Resser, John Douglas, Pat Brown, Brent Turvey. You know what I'm saying? There's not very many of us. It's that ridiculous. Clint Van Zandt. Okay,
there's only a few guys, and it's not like they're on the tips of everybody's tongue. You're really showing people.
From the television,
Yeah, and you're really demystifying it. You've done a bunch of interviews with mainstream media where, and the book really goes through the details too, where it's a self-education. You homeschooled your kids, and you homeschooled yourself to a great. There are no specific serial killer profile courses, like you say. You can't just go to the FBI and say, "Hey, I got the affinity for this. Why don't you train me?" And like you say, there
hasn't been. Yeah, I had to train myself because it didn't exist. But I did create the first criminal profiling certificate program in the country up at Excelsior College. However, sad to say, they've been watering that one down, and so consequently, I've had to part ways with them. And I can tell people that's one place you may learn profiling. But since I no longer have control over the program and I don't know what they've done to it, I feel kind of remiss telling people to go there now. But I'm hoping I'm going to be working on the Pat Brown Criminal Profiling School, which I'm going to hopefully get up someday in the future. It's going to take a lot of work because I spent 2 years developing the one for Excelsior, and I have to start over again. But I'm hoping this time I'll have control over it so I can put together what people really, really need to know to learn how to profile. And hopefully one day this will spawn more programs because, again, I don't ever want to have a monopoly on something. I'm perfectly happy if there turns into 20, 30 programs across the United States so that people can learn this and go into detective work, or people can become profiles and work with departments so that it becomes part of the methodology. Because we need to solve these crimes. We need to get these killers off the street. And having a few profiling gods running around really isn't doing the job. So I'm hoping that one day, I'll wake up and I'll actually be able to say, wow, there's a profiler in every police department. How cool is that? So that is where I'm headed. That's my goal.
Yeah, that's a very, very lofty goal and a very worthy goal as well. And I agree with you. And I hope I know your fight will take root. I mean, it's just like Robert K. Ressler.
I have to live long enough. I think that's the biggest problem. And the recession, of course, is putting a damper on a whole bunch of stuff. It's just killing. It's killing income, and it's killing police departments being able to, provide, bring in training, and it's killing people's ability to go to school. So the recession, hopefully we will come out of it, although it's looking pretty bleak this month. But I've slowed down a lot this year because of the disastrous economy. But it's my hope that we'll pull through this. And I'm 55 now. My mother's 90, so I got 35 more years. I figure if I don't live quite as well as she does, so maybe I only got 25 years. But if I don't get hit by a truck or one of my stalkers kills me, but I hope that I can, really get these things at some point, get the goals accomplished, and I'll feel good about that. That what I set out to do has made a difference. Maybe you can't get somebody like Walt Williams off the street if he's guilty, but maybe there'll be another person, who. Because we get profilers into the departments, we'll find our closure rates increase, and it'll save a lot of victims from having to go through what Dan Kelly went through, back in 1990. I just wouldn't wish that on anybody.
Yeah, and it's I think a vast improvement in regular citizens recognizing certain things will then prompt them to bring evidence to the police, and if police have better training and, as you advocate strongly, better crime linkage, better statistics of the details of crime that are not so general so as to assist. So if you, again, a refinement of the system and certainly always refining the system, you can get to recognizing these people, because serial killers and psychopathic killers really are very unique from a lot of the homicides that especially small communities see, and hence their police experience. So they need to see this when the serial killer moves into the little town. Because it's not just all domestic war.
And they are moving around quite well. We have an increase in them. So, I mean, it's, we don't want to be, constantly behind. So, yes, I hope that we can improve that all the way around. I think the most important thing about that is for people to stop ignoring reality and stop, and just being very open and truthful. And the detectives out there, I totally support them. They work very, very hard. They're way overworked. They have way too many cases in certain jurisdictions to even deal with anything. They're very discouraged a lot of times by our prosecutorial system, and they're burned out and don't feel like doing crap because it's like, how hard do we have to work not to get anywhere? We get all the evidence and you won't even take it to court. So, I mean, they're frustrated too. There's a lot of issues that go on, and the politics is very, very bad. So, I mean, the detectives, and some of them don't get training. Some of them just end up in a job maybe they shouldn't be in. They're great police. They're great cops on the street, and maybe really shouldn't have been made into detectives because they don't have the logic, even though they might be good on certain crimes just because they have to gather information. So they might be good detectives for, crimes where the suspect is known. They might be fabulous detectives, but where it comes down to crime reconstruction, they may lack that. And so why not give them support? Instead of saying they can do 90% of their job, but they lack the 10% they need for crime reconstruction, why not have somebody on their team just to help them out? I mean, so everybody can just do a better job together. And I think that's what I'd like to get, all this egotism and, refusal to look at the reality. Let's look at it. Let's look at it and fix it and not blame anybody. Let's just try to figure out what needs to be done and keep working on it.
Well, I think why you've had cooperation with police departments, despite not being with the FBI and getting, the big call from, Quantico, this is the FBI, and I'm a famous profiler, is that your system is logical and makes a lot of sense and is relatable to these guys. They're not coming in. The FBI have had a lot of problems sending profilers in to look at certain crimes, and the local police have sent these people home. Said, forget that. We don't need profiles.
Well, not necessarily. I think the problem there is that the local police department doesn't want the FBI in the jurisdiction because, they're working the case, and the FBI tend to come in and kind of take over unless they have a really good relationship with a certain FBI agent. And there's some FBI agents I have a lot of respect for. I mentioned Brad Garrett before. I've always had respect for Brad Garrett. I think he's a great guy. I think he's a very good agent. I mean, there's certain ones that really have established themselves well with police departments. And certainly, under certain circumstances, when they need a team, then when they really have, they need a major search effort, they have a huge problem with crossing state lines, certain issues, that having the FBI team is welcomed. They have no problem with that, and I think the FBI team does a great job.
Sure.
But when you actually have the profiler coming in, a lot of the police don't believe in the FBI inductive profiling. I think they do believe more in the deductive profiling I do, but they're still skeptical. And they still don't like me coming in most of the time. I have some call me up, but the rest of them are like, I don't know about you.
Yeah.
Because I'm coming in, and essentially what I'm doing is saying, here's what happens sometimes. They're willing to have me come in because they're hoping I will agree with their theory and find them some new piece of evidence. And then they can solve the case, and they look good because it was their theory, but now they just have a few more pieces of evidence. But what happens is if I come in and I go, oh, you're wrong, you got the wrong suspect, now now they're embarrassed. She came in and told us we were wrong. And they will admit to me while I'm sitting there, yeah, you're right. We never saw that. You're correct about that. So wow, we just never saw that. They realized they didn't have the skills to do the crime reconstruction, and they missed it. But when I walk out of there, they will not tell anybody that I figured it out because they feel embarrassed, or their police chief tells them to shut the hell up. Don't tell a family that we're wrong for 5 years. So there's a lot of politics, and I don't really blame the detectives for that. They're in a really crappy situation. So that's why I think the whole system needs a little bit more, openness and support.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you've done a fine job in setting the standard for everybody, and this book is just a fantastic read, and it's just a great cause that you're starting here as well, in terms of people being able to relate to your story and seeing exactly how you became involved with profiling and where it has led you in your life with this. So it's amazing. And I want to tell people they've been listening to the Pat Brown and her book, The Profiler, My Life Hunting Serial Killers and Psychopaths. I want to thank you very much, Pat Brown, for coming on the program. It's been fascinating, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I'm going to remember your line. If you can't teach it, it's not scientific. That is correct.
That's right.
That's fine.
Okay, well, you have a very good evening, and the best of luck, and I'll talk to you again in the near future, I hope.
Sounds like a plan,
Have a good night.
All right,
bye-bye.
Good night. Bye.
You've been listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Zapasky. Good evening.